Hello, my darling listeners. Before we get into, I'd say, the well-written and reported book Thunder on the Right by Alan Crawford, I find it necessary to offer some context to explain some things that would have been obvious to any reader in 1980 but may be lost on a modern audience. Before I go into my introduction, I would like to thank Alan Crawford himself for giving me permission to make this audiobook, and while I'm thanking people, I'd like to thank Timber on Toast for letting me use his music. Had some nice background stuff to it, you know. So first off, this book was published in 1980, so it was, written sometime in the mid to late 70s. Likewise, one thing that many new rightists were mad about at the time was the then proposed treaty to return the Panama Canal to Panama. Said canal was under U.S. jurisdiction as the Panama Canal Zone from 1903 to 1979. Some of you may recall that during the 2008 election, there was confusion as to whether or not GOP candidate John McCain counted as being a natural-born citizen because he was born in Panama. The fact was, he was born in the Panama Canal Zone, which, at the time of his birth, was a U.S. territory. The Torrijos-Carter Treaty, which formally turned the canal back to Panama, was signed and ratified in 1977. At the time this book was written, the so-called loss of the canal stung a lot of right-wingers hard, especially coupled with the then-recent loss of Vietnam. Likewise, the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, was a proposed constitutional amendment which said the following: "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." At this point in time, it was incredibly close to being ratified, and while we currently know that it inevitably was not ratified, the author is writing this from a time when it could have been, or at least was, still very big in the public consciousness. Now, perhaps the most important thing I'll have to explain is the state the GOP was in at the time this book was written. I'm going to have to give a bit of a Reader's Digest version of this. If you would like more details, I highly recommend Rick Perlstein's books Before the Storm, Nixonland, The Invisible Bridge, and Reaganland in that order. So let's go back in time to 1948, when Dewey did not defeat Truman. The GOP had lost 5 presidential elections in a row, 4 to FDR and 1 to Truman. And they were going through a bit of a soul-searching moment. The GOP eventually split into 2 main factions. Both factions in turn had smaller factions within them, but they aren't as relevant as the 2 big ones. You had the conservative Republicans, informally led by Senator Robert Taft Sr. of Ohio, and you had the liberal moderates, informally led initially by Thomas E. Dewey, the same one who failed to defeat Truman, and later informally led by Nelson Rockefeller, son of John Rockefeller. The liberal moderates later became known as the Rockefeller Republicans, Eastern Establishment, or sometimes simply the Liberal Republicans. Both Dewey and Rockefeller were from the New York area, likewise FDR was as well. This will be important later. These 2 factions had different views on American politics. The liberal moderates saw the 5 victories as evidence that the American people wanted American-style liberalism, and they needed to run a candidate who could moderate the liberal ambitions of the dominant wing of the Democrats. The conservatives argued that there was a swath of American conservatives who saw both the GOP and Dems as too liberal, and thus chose to stay home rather than actually vote. They wanted to run a conservative candidate who could galvanize this sleeping giant. These 2 factions first met headlong in the 1952 GOP presidential primaries. The liberal moderates had beloved war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower as their candidate. The conservatives had iconic conservative Robert Taft as theirs. Now, before I continue, I should explain the way these conventions used to work. Nowadays, the conventions are almost ceremonial, but back in the day, they were far more important. Few states had any sort of elected primary for delegates, and most of the delegates were assigned by the state's Republican or Democratic parties. Most of these delegates would be unpledged, and this is where things get interesting. Most of the unpledged delegates would wait on the sidelines. Statewide political bosses would negotiate behind closed doors with various candidates, and when they came to a deal, the delegates would vote according to what their boss told them to. Then, if the candidate won the nomination in the presidency, he would pass down some patronage to the boss, who in turn would pass them down to the delegates. Of course, not all delegates were like this. There were plenty of delegates who were committed activists, the kind who cared more about their political ideals than patronage. During the 1952 RNC, the 2 main contenders for the nomination were Eisenhower and Taft. A candidate needed 604 delegates to win. As you can see from this image right here, Eisenhower came to the convention with 595 delegates, already negotiated backstage somehow, while Taft came with 500. Now it's close, but there's no victor quite yet. The important man to note here, though, you can see a little lower on the list, is former Minnesota Governor Harold Stanson. In the first round, he had only 20 delegates, and since he had so few delegates, his delegates were not obligated to support him in the next round of voting. He struck a deal with Eisenhower to give him the delegates needed to push him over the edge. Once that happened, many delegates fled from the other candidates to coalesce around the winner and hopefully get some of that Schweet patronage, baby. Of course, we can see that there were still plenty of true believers who stayed firm by their preferred candidate in the second round. Taft wasn't happy to have lost, but he accepted his defeat and campaigned for Eisenhower. In one of the first articles I read, the one on the pseudo-conservative revolt, you may recall that Hofstadter referenced a woman who stormed out of the RNC claiming that Eisenhower's victory meant 8 more years of socialism. Well, I don't know who that lady was. It's likely she was a Taft supporter. Eisenhower won, and it seemed like the moderate liberals were in control. After Eisenhower's 8 years of socialism, the 1960 RNC came about. Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, won the nomination, and he was somehow able to breach the divide between the moderate liberals and the conservatives. I'm not sure exactly how, he just was. After his narrow defeat by JFK, the moderate libs argued that he wasn't liberal enough, and the cons argued he wasn't conservative enough. Nixon just took the L and went back home to California for a while. Now at this point, the cons were ready for revenge. They remembered being, screwed over by the Eastern establishment in 1952, and they still felt screwed over by that establishment in 1960. They found their future leader in the form of Barry Goldwater, the eccentric senator from Arizona. The cons spent the next 4 years preparing their strategy to capture delegates for Goldwater in the 1964 RNC. When Rockefeller tried to use his name and massive fortune to effectively buy the nomination, he was outmaneuvered by the skillful organizing and decades of rage that the cons had built up. Perhaps my favorite moment from the 1964 RNC convention was this one, where Nelson Rockefeller requested that the RNC official party platform include various civil rights language. I should say that even though this recording was from 1964, the version that I'm using with the subtitles is a replay from a future date, hence the reference to Rockefeller's governorship lasting into the 70s.
That's all I can see.
Delegates, please take their seats so that the governor can be heard. We are under limitation of time. The governor of New York is recognized for 5 minutes, and please give him your attention.
Mr. Chairman, Congressman Laird, fellow delegates, alternates, and friends, I move that the language read by Senator Scott be inserted in the proposed 1964 Republican platform.
I just love how that one guy yelled "no" so loudly that even the crappy mics back then could pick it up. Anyway, the Conservatives clearly won the 1964 primary, but as you can see in this map, they lost the presidential election big time. Even though Barry Goldwater took the loss rather gracefully, the cons were undeterred and they took full advantage of the connections they made during the previous few years, as well as the civil unrest, riots, and upheavals that occurred during LBJ's administration. They organized even more and became stronger than ever. When Richard Nixon came back and won twice, these new right conservatives, they were a bit mixed on him. Nixon may have personally, ideologically been a conservative, but he was also a practical individual. Many of his blue-collar supporters skewed older and remembered the Depression and were supporters of New Deal-style social programs. Likewise, Nixon was far more willing to negotiate with China and try to open relationships with them rather than just try to declare China a pariah and possibly even invade. I'll admit I don't exactly recall what the full-on conservative desires for China were at the time, but I do recall a bunch of them just weren't happy with Nixon going to China. However, when Watergate happened, a lot of them rallied around him, as many of the cons felt utterly convinced that Nixon was being framed for something he didn't do. Either that, or they thought that what he did wasn't all that bad and that the quote-unquote left did worse stuff regularly. You may recall from my video where I read Pearlstein's article about right-wing grifters called The Long Con, how Pearlstein talked about giving a speech to some conservatives about Nixon, and many of the cons there talked about how they knew Nixon was one of them not because of his policies or preferences, but because of Watergate. Likewise, you may recall, if you read the text messages of Ginny Thomas, wife of Justice Clarence Thomas, that she explicitly mentioned how bad Watergate was, not because of what happened, but because Nixon gave in and resigned and admitted to doing bad stuff. After Watergate, the cons went into overdrive, absolutely convinced that they were the victims of a liberal smear campaign by the liberal Washington Post and the rest of the so-called liberal establishment. They ran all Ronnie the Ray Gun to try to primary out President Gerald Ford in '76. Now, Gerald Ford was by no means liberal. I mean, he did have some liberal leanings, but he did support the ERA and was relatively quiet on Roe v. Wade, which had happened recently at that point. It may seem impossible to primary out a sitting president, but as we can see right here, Ford, the incumbent, won by a razor-thin margin. There were 2,199 delegates total, and Ford won by a mere 48. Now, for anyone who's not American listening to this and might need a bit of an explanation about what I mean by this, many American elections have a primary election in which the two main parties, Republican and Democratic, and, many other party who wants to run, will usually have smaller elected contests known as primaries, in which sometimes only members of the parties, these are known as closed primaries, or anybody, these are known as open primaries, can vote to determine which candidate or candidates the party will nominate for such elected office. If an incumbent is running for re-election, they generally have the advantage through things like name recognition, through having the connections of having to have won a previous primary election, usually having the support of the party establishment and their resources to help them out. And, it's a pretty big deal if somebody who is running for re-election loses in the primary election. Now, I should say that this was the first RNC convention in which every state and DC had elected primaries for the delegates. Ronald Reagan took the L pretty well, and when Ford lost the general election in 1976 to Jimmy Carter, Reagan prepared for 1980 to try to win the primary in that year. This is around where the book takes place. At the moment, it's a bit unsure whether or not Reagan had won the 1980 primary contest yet, as there was a pretty hefty competition between Ronald Reagan and his future vice president, George H.W. Bush. However, it is pretty clear that when this book was written, Jimmy Carter was still president. The 1980 presidential election had not yet happened. And, there's a bit of a countdown of some sort to the 1980 presidential election. Now, why did I explain all this? Well, it's important to note that when this book was written, not only were liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats far more common than they are today, but many conservative activists clearly remembered when the GOP was dominated by the more left-leaning side of the party. Nowadays, the right wing has total control over the GOP, but at this point, the right was only really starting to cement itself within the entirety of the GOP establishment, and this book reflects that time period. Personally, I hypothesize that the GOP rhetoric of being quote-unquote anti-establishment originated from this kind of era. For a while, the conservatives absolutely were not in the establishment of the GOP, but now they are. Despite this, they still use the same rhetoric from back when calling the president a communist would get you laughed and shamed out of the room instead of just being expected out of the GOP today. Hey. Basically, what you have to know is that when this book was written, the idea of liberal Republicans or conservative Democrats and that sort of stuff, they were much weaker than they once were, but were still a large force within the GOP and a disliked enemy among much of the new right, as discussed in the book. Likewise, the coalescing specifically against these so-called liberal Republicans was one driving force among the new right that is commonly used as a way to unite seemingly disparate and different factions of the right wing together. Now, likewise, I want you, my darling listeners, to focus on the rhetorical style of the new right presented within the book. You'll notice that much of it is, well, it's pretty much exactly the effing same as you'd hear today. Stuff about how everything from the media, the courts, the culture, and even the GOP itself is biased against so-called normal or ordinary people. The author identifies as conservative. He makes it very clear within the early parts of the book. However, he might sound left-leaning early on to any listener who's a bit confused, and it did actually confuse me the first time I read it. But don't worry, close to the end he really starts flexing his conservative philosophy. He even described himself to me as Burkean, Humean, and Oakeshotian. For anyone confused by my pronunciation, Humean refers to David Hume. He is not referring to himself as a human being. Hopefully that covers everything. Now, let's get into this bad boy. Thunder on the Right, The New Right and the Politics of Resentment by Alan Crawford. Published in 1980 by Pantheon Books, New York, New York. Preface. It surprises me to a certain extent that I should have had to write this book at all. I would have thought that some conservative journalist of far greater stature would have come forward to speak frankly on the new right and its damaging effect on the conservative cause. When no one did, I did, in a sense, to clear my name. I have written this book because I am a conservative myself, convinced that the activities of the new right have the potential of being far more damaging to the conservative cause than anything the liberal opposition might do, in much the same way that Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon set back the cause of anti-communism. This book consequently represents my own attempt to come to terms with my experiences on the right. From 1973 through 1979, I worked for Human Events, Conservative Digest, Young Americans for Freedom, and New York Senator James L. Buckley, a genuine conservative Buckley, attending receptions, parties, conventions, and luncheons. Unfortunately, the more I saw, the less I liked, and the more convinced I became that the political activities of the new right, which came to dominate the conservative community during those years, were not only unconservative but anti-conservative for reasons that follow. If it is the responsibility of liberals to expose the radicals, revolutionaries, opportunists, and demagogues who operate in or try to infiltrate their ranks, then it is no less the responsibility of conservatives to disavow and disassociate themselves from the radicals, reactionaries, and hucksters who work on their side of the street. In that spirit, I call on liberal journalists to subject to similar scrutiny their own organizations and their fundraising activities, before assuming on the evidence presented in this book that such activities are peculiar to the right. There are clearly many identifiable right-wing organizations in America reflecting in different degrees the nation's turn to the right, but not all can be treated here. I have, for example, excluded some of those that my evidence suggests are outside the mainstream of American politics, too small in following or so far to the right as to border on fascism, and such irrelevant to the broader currents this book is trying to analyze. I have excluded the Ku Klux Klan, the Liberty Lobby, and the American Nazi Party, whose neo-fascist ideology is at the farthest point in the right-wing continuum. They are too extreme to reflect the ideology or concerns of the new right itself. The John Birch Society, however, is included here because of the extent to which its membership, and in some cases leadership, overlaps that of the new right. The splinter American Independent Party is given only passing reference in this context of a brief attempt by new right leaders to seize its organizational structure. It seems to me that the new right represents a serious threat to the nation only to the extent that presumably responsible leaders fail to address the conditions that have given rise to the tensions and anxieties that the new right so effectively exploits. The new right, after all, cannot create these tensions. At least it is addressing them, and I see no one else who is. If we must suffer Joe McCarthy's, we should bear in mind we must do so only when responsible leaders fail to come to terms with the anxieties such demagogues exploit. Finally, I would direct the attention of my new right critics to the words of my dear friend Peter Viereck, a veteran of controversies far more consequential than these, that any attempt to scrape the barnacles off an excellent but aging boat is never considered an attack upon it, except by the barnacles. I would like to express my deepest appreciation for the encouragement and unflagging support of the Reverend Daniel McEver, Archbishop C. Puddington, Kent Christopher Owen, E. Scott Royce, Edward W. Tallman, and John C. Topping Jr., and to Jeanette Hopkins, that tough taskmaster and extraordinary editor with whom the opportunity to work has been an honor as well as an education. Signed, Alan Crawford, New York City, 1979.